By the end of this video, we should pretty much have a working game. To get there, we're going to cover how to use if statements and else if statements more specifically, public variables, and how these can be achieved to create a game state in which we can detect when the game has ended. And finally, we're just going to cover very briefly a little bit of velocity on how we can stop movement of characters. We have our 4 pickups which we can pick up, and that will increase the score. However, as it currently stands, if we ride over the drop downs, nothing happens. Okay, so we're now going to look at fixing that. It's pretty simple to do. It's more or less duplicating the code we've already got. So if we go to player controller, down on trigger, we're detecting the pickup, but we're not detecting the drop down. So I'm just going to duplicate that code. I'm going to throw it in as an else if. So it's just a slightly more efficient way of doing things. I'm just going to automatically format the code. So we'll go to Edit, Advanced, Format Document. Do it for me. That's how it wants it to look. Okay. The only thing I've really got to do here is change this to a drop down. And I need to change what function it calls yet, but let's just make sure that works. So if that's working correctly, drop down should behave exactly the same as the pickups. So pickups still work. Drop downs also increase the score. So it's detecting them, it's just calling the wrong function. So now I want to go over to Game Manager, and I'm going to create a new public one called decrease count, and make that count equals count minus 1. Then it will still call this function exactly the same. I want to call decrease count from my player controller, and that should now decrease the score. So if I go back to my game, I need to go over to Game Manager and save that first. Now I go back to my game, and just checking. That increases the score, decreases the score. However, now it carries the current sense, it'll go into minuses. So we need to go into our Game Manager and modify this code slightly and say else if count is less than or equal to 0, when text equals, you lose. Alright, so I'll save that, and I'll go back into my game. So what I expect to happen now is that when I go into minuses, it should actually say you lose. So I'll just go straight for a red one. You lose. However, the game keeps playing, which is not ideal. So we'll address that now. To do that, we are going to make a public variable. Just do it under here. Call it public. It's going to be a bool. Bools are either true or false. And we're going to just call this is game active. When the game starts, we want to make sure that is game active is set to true. Now we want to, so whenever either the game is won or lost, we're going to say set that to equal false. So if the game is won, it'll set is game active to false. If the game is lost, it'll set is game active to false. Okay, so now we want to use that variable. first thing we want to do is stop the player moving around. So we'll go over to player controller. We've already got access to the game manager, that line of code we wrote there. So because we have access to game manager, if I type in game manager there, dot is, you'll see that I can actually access the variable is game active, which makes it nice and simple to do the next stage. I want to do a check before I move the character. I'm going to say if game equals true, then move the character around. Okay. So that would mean that when I lose the game, I can no longer control the character. Let's just test that out. You can see that when I collect a red drop down, my keyboard no longer responds. However, momentum still carries them through, so we need to lock that momentum. To do that, we're going to go back to our player controller, and we're going to chuck in an else statement here. What that else is basically going to say that if the game active is not active, i.e. the game is over, then stop the velocity of the ball. So we've got RB from up here, which is the rigid body of the player. We're going to set velocity of that equals, and we're just going to create a new vector. There's multiple ways you could achieve this, but I found this the simplest. Alright, so all that's going to do is the velocity, which is its directional movement, is set at 0, 0, 0. So in other words, it locks it in place. If I save that and go back to my game, now if I lose, we're almost there. And the last thing we have to do is stop our objects rotating. So if we go to our rotator script, that's pretty much going to be achieved the same way as we did in player controller. So I'm just going to do some copy and pasting. We want to copy this to the beginning of our rotator, because we need to get access to that is game active variable. Then in start, I'm going to copy that, paste that down there, and finally I can put an if statement there, say if game manager dot is active equals true, and that should be it. So we're creating a new variable of type script game manager. We're assigning to that variable, we're finding the script and assigning it to the game manager, and then we're checking the variable inside that script. If it's true, rotate it. So obviously if the game's over, it'll stop the rotation. So if we lose, everything's locked, it all stops rotating, and it looks nice and pretty.